Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Top Cut Academy. I'm Professor Benji, and today I am bringing you my tournament review and deck guide to Tox Box, my Toxtricity deck that I took to Birmingham Regionals. I put up a video about this in the lead up to the event, saying that I was playing it and why I thought it was a good play, and I am very, very happy to say that I finished with a day 2 in the top 300 players. And yeah, I was really pleased overall with how everything went. I think that every card that I picked for the deck played a part and had some sort of purpose in every single win, tie, or loss that I had. I felt that everything was very utilised. So I think it's quite rare to say that going to a tournament, all 60 cards that you played really played a relevant role in everything you did. But I really felt at this time it was. And so, yeah, here I am. I'm going to take you through everything. Very excited with obviously making this achievement with a deck that I sort of created off my own back and tested, as it was very much on the outside. And I was actually the only deck of this kind to make day 2. There was another Brute Bonnet deck that played a lot of recyclers and stuff that was piloted by somebody else that made day 2, but a sort of box with Toxtricity. I was the only one to make it, so I was very pleased with that overall as well. So without further ado, let's get into the deck and show you what it's all about. So this is the final list that I settled on. So in the last video that I posted before Birmingham, the Team Rocket Sneasel that you see over here was actually an Evital, and this TM Evolution was actually a Turbo Energize. Now, the reason that I went for these two things is that I felt that Evital, although it was a one prize version of the sort of lock that Petrant can do, I felt that a lot of decks at the minute have outs to be in clutch, to be in locked in the active, and that's not the main purpose of Petrant, as we'll go into further on in this video. The lock in the active is definitely something that's very important about the card and is very useful, but it's not sort of the main reason we use it in a lot of matchups. It's just sort of an added bonus. We mainly use it to get damage counters down early in the game, so we don't have to rely too much on Monkey Dory. Now, so by taking that into account, I thought, what is the deck lacking? And of course, due to the nature of the deck, it's lacking a lot of gust, just because we need to draw into cards, we need to draw a lot of combos, we don't have much on board that can draw us cards. Therefore, we need to maximize the fact that we're using draw supporters every single turn, just to make sure the deck is ticking over. So therefore, we only play one boss and one counter catcher. So to counteract that, I thought having access to the opponent's bench without the need for gust in the early game would be something that's really beneficial, and that's where I landed on Team Rocket Sneasel. Now I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we go through the list and its purpose, but Sneasel definitely played its part and was very useful into the likes of Gardevoir and Dragapult throughout the day. And then I switched the TM Evo for the Turbo Energize. The Turbo Energize is really good. I felt that it was very strong into the Guardy matchup, just because you were able to get those Monkey Dories online, and then very similar to sort of the Guardy list that played it last season with Isaiah Bradner. I think that getting those Monkey Dories up early can actually play a big role in you being able to beat Guardy. However, I felt that it was a little bit weaker into all of the other matchups, so felt a bit of a waste to do in a lot of other cases. Whereas TM Evo allowed us to get round item lock in both the Jealous and Guardy builds, which was very good for us, and also Budu in Dragapult or anything else that was playing it. I did actually play a Greninja in the first round of the tournament, and the only reason I was able to get a tie into that matchup, as I don't feel like it is a good matchup, was due to the TM Evil being able to aggressively get into those Toxtricities while being Budooed, to make sure that we could sort of set up and establish attackers as early as turn 2. So the TM Evo definitely paying off there. I do think there maybe can be a reason to play the Turbo Energizer in the future, but I do think overall the TM Evo is good and thins your deck at the same time of your Toxtricities, and you're still able to get those energies out then the following turn with Sinister Sturge. But I would say for sure that Team Rocket Sneasel definitely played its part, was definitely a useful card throughout the day, and I would make the permanent switch from Evital to that from my original list. So let's break everything down in more detail. The core of the deck is 4 Toxel, 3 Toxtricity, and 3 Monkey Dory. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory: energy acceleration, damage modification, and early game consistency. So, the Toxel, early game consistency. On the card, it has a call for family attack. For 1 dark, you can search your deck for 2 Pokemon, put them straight onto your bench, and then shuffle your deck. So this can be your Monkey Dories. This can be a Pheasantipity if you believe that Toxel is going to be knocked out on the following turn. This can be your attackers that you want to use. Anything that you might need, this Toxel can add to that. So it's actually a really essential part of the deck that if our first hand isn't as good, we don't get something like an Arven, we don't get our Buddy Buddy Poffin because it's prized, stuff like that. This Toxel can utilize Call for Family, and obviously the trade-off of 1 prize for setting up our board is not bad at all. Then Toxtricity is not only our energy acceleration, but it's our main means of damage modification. Now, the Monkey Dory is going to move that damage to our opponent's board, but this is the way that we generate our damage. Unlike a lot of other Absol decks and stuff like that, they aren't able to actually generate their own damage unless sort of new inclusions such as the Risky Ruins, but we are, in our deck, able to generate our own damage. It is 2 damage at a time, but that is more than enough for a lot of the Pokemon that we're aiming to knock out with Brute Bonnet. And obviously, the Toxtricity can continue to push out energy when we don't need it to keep that damage ticking over, or you can sort of utilize it very, very sparingly to set up exactly what you need when you need it. And obviously, different matchups will call for that at different times. So next up, we have our attackers. We have 2 Brute Bonnet, 1 Petulant, 1 Mega Absol, and 1 Team Rocket Sneasel. Brute Bonnet, the only double up of attackers, as that is probably the only thing in the deck we're most definitely going to attack twice with in pretty much every matchup, and something that we want the option of seeing every single game. I think that in a lot of the matchups we can prize some of the other Pokemon, but Brute Bonnet is not something we can ever risk prizing, just because it's so powerful and allows us to get through pretty much everything on our opponent's side of the board. But without further ado, let me take you through each one individually. So we've got our Brute Bonnet. It's got an infinite damage cap that relentless punches 50 plus 50 for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. Now, that is obviously very good, but just some key numbers. We only need 4 damage to get rid of a Goldengo. That is just 2 Sinister Surges and 2 Monkey Dory movements, and we are able to bust through any 2 prize Goldengo matchup. We only need 3 damage counters to get through things like, obviously not regarding weakness, but things like Mew, Miraidon, Pheasantipity. Only 3 damage counters needed for that. You've got to remember that 50 plus 50, 3 is 150, plus the 50 for the start of Relentless Punches, and then the 3 damage that you've already got there from the Monkey Dory gets factored in as well. So for 3 damage, getting all the way to 230. So it's got really, really good trade-up capabilities. Due to that, we don't need a lot to get this thing going. Our Toxtricities are in a thick count of 4-3. They're going to come down every single game, and this Pokemon is able to get through pretty much everything as long as they're there. And as you know, and as we're going to discuss, there is more than one way of getting damage onto our opponent, not just relying on our Monkey Dories. We have some really great sort of backup attackers in this deck that allow us to set up those knockouts in other ways if our Monkey Dories have not seen the board quite as easy as we like to. This is used in the mid to late game. The 3 energy attack cost is not something that is sort of you want to be leaning into early. We have a lot of other ways and smaller attackers to start picking off our 1 prizes. You know, Brute Bonnet, not really efficient to use into other small Pokemon. We want to be using it into some of our bigger threats to try and get those trade ups. And so we'll use the Petulant and the Team Rocket Sneasel to sort of navigate the early game and take those knockouts to start setting up our Brute Bonnet. Now, it's probably the most direct and straight down the middle card in the deck. It sort of has its one use, and that's to take big knockouts, but he is our superstar of the deck. I already loved Brute Bonnet. I loved Amoonguss, but he's grown on me even more now after this weekend's run. Such a cool Pokemon, and I really, really hope that he gets a full art at some point. Need to bling this thing out. But yeah, really, really powerful attacker, and it gets us over the line in a lot of the matchups. So our next attacker is Mega Absol EX. It is a 3 prize Mega, so sort of goes against a lot of what the deck does, which is trying to trade up. but it can force us into a lot of games. As you can see there, it partners very well with Unfair Stamp, as it is a very disruptive attacker. Now, I think the best example I can give you of this, as I will sort of hash on this as I go through my tournament run later on in the video, but when I went against Guardi the first couple of times, I really sort of avoided putting Mega Absol down, as I wanted to keep a one-prize board and hopefully trade up at some point. However, as you can imagine, they're able to get down just as much Monkey Dories as us, so the chance to take a two-prize turn only ever really comes into play if we're able to A, gust a Guardi, or B, they leave a little bit too much damage on their screen tail, where we're able to actually ping that and then attack with a secondary attacker into the active. But that is unlikely, especially with good Gardevoir players. They're going to know the cost and the risk of everything they're doing, and sometimes you can get caught in a trap by doing that as you open up Counter Catcher for them. So there's lots of reasons not to do this. And that's where I found that in sort of game 2 against Phil D'Souza, I actually started Mega Absol EX, and it was stuck in the active for a little bit. But then later on in the game, I used Unfair Stamp, used Glory Darkness, and I pulled myself back into the game and really forced myself onto the board, as they weren't able to do a lot. The energy was already committed. I was using that. The Pokemon was trapped sort of on the bench, and I was attacking and then healing any damage they were doing with their screen tail, with my Monkey Dories, as Absol is quite big. So it was really, really strong. Unfortunately, I did end up losing that, but later on in the day, I got a win and a draw into Gardevoir, and in both those games, I was able to utilize Mega Absol a lot earlier in the game, and that allowed me to take a lot more advantage of Unfair Stamp and Iono at multiple points in the game to make sure I really, really disrupted my opponent's hand. And then I think that, it's always worth mentioning terminal period. We do have a Brute Bonnet that's able to get through humongous attackers. We're able to hit absolute teens of damage. 7 damage counters knocks out anything in the format. And of course, that's not as easy to get as you might think. 6 is very achievable, but 7 a little bit more awkward. However, it is something that terminal period can take charge of and push for a little bit easier than getting our Brute Bonnets down. It's only 2 energy attachments, so we need a little bit less commitment from toxicities on our bench. And of course, we could perhaps have 1 or 2 damage already on the opponent's active, but we only need the 2 charge ups from Sinister Surge to get terminal period going. So it's always an option, but I would say that Mega Absol is more used for Glory Darkness and that sort of disrupted side of the card. Then next up we have our Petulant. Now this, in my opinion, is the most important card in the deck. I don't think you need 2 of them, just because it's not always able to be utilized as much as you'd like, but I do think that it is absolutely unmatched in the early game. Now it's an alternative to Monkey Dory, and the way that I can explain that is that we do need attachments to our Monkey Dories naturally, as we can't use Sinister Surge to them. So we either need an energy switch early game, or we need energy in hand as well as Nespor Artisan to get monkeys down. However, if we aren't able to get that, we can use Petulant to damage our opponent's active. We're always trading up in this deck, 1 prizes, or we can even take 2 for 2, and we are staying in line with our opponent. So this Petulant can come into the active, Poison Chain, plus the 60 they're going to be taken from poison, and they go up to 70 damage. That is going to be enough for our Brute Bonnet to come in the following turn and take knockouts. Now, the other way that this damage can be utilized is that if we're up against a deck like Goldengo, as I've mentioned, is a good matchup for this deck previously, we're able to come up and use Petulant into a Goldengo, leave damage there, meaning on the following turn, we've got enough damage for our Brute Bonnet to be able to knock out a Goldengo, and we can actually prioritize moving more Sinister Surge damage over to the bench, meaning that we've also got a knockout on the follow-up attacker. You know that Goldengo is going to be using the same attacker pretty much the whole way through the game once Soul Rock becomes ineffective, and so we're able to take a big advantage of that. Now, of course, Poison Chain does lock our opponent in the active as well. That's not really what we're going for with this deck, as if Petulant is in the active as well, they're eventually going to knock themselves out, simply because the poison tick is actually quite significant. 6 between turns, and obviously 7 on the turn that you use Poison Chain on the active. So it is really important to note that the likelihood of you being able to stall something in the active all the way through a game to try and win is unlikely, just due to that toxic subjugation ability, making them take damage. So that is something to bear in mind. You don't want to try and use this thing to lock full time. It's more of a case of locking something in the active to get damage down that can then be monopolized on to take multi-prize turns, or leave it there to take a knockout later in the game. Another good example is sort of gusting up something with 100, 110, 120 HP, leaving that damage there, and later on in the game you can use a couple of movements from Monkey Dory to take a knockout on that on the bench perhaps, and then take a knockout in the active. And I think the final note on Petulant, and probably the coolest part of the card, is it does not activate Vezendipity, if used effectively. If you use it and make sure the poison knocks out our opponent's active Pokemon instead of the poison chain attack, Vezendipity does not activate, as the knockout happened in Pokemon Checkup between turns. Now, this is really effective against decks that are a little bit more aggressive, Raging Bolt, Goldengo, Terrazard, stuff like that, as it means we can combine this with something like an Unfair Stamp and an Iono, take a knockout, and of course make sure they aren't able to draw out of that very easily. And then we can pivot into our big attackers, our Brute Bonnets, our Mega Absol, to make sure our opponent never finds their footing again. So Petulant, definitely the most Swiss Army knife attacker in the deck. It can do a lot of different things, and it really did carry over the weekend. I was really, really, really happy with this inclusion, and I love this card. And then finally, the latest change to the deck, and definitely the underrated card of the weekend, just because of how many opponents picked it up and read it, did not know what it did, and was very much ignored a lot of the time. When it hit the board, my opponents would sort of not really see much of a threat until Team Rocket Sneasel started doing its job. Now, the first and most important thing about this card is the final point on this list, and it allows for less Gus in the deck. Now, we only play one boss and one counter catcher, and that's mainly because we don't have any on-board draw apart from Vezendipity. And of course, in a lot of matches, we don't want to be putting down a two-prizer, so we're able to keep a real nice one-prize board. So Team Rocket Sneasel then allows us to access our opponent's bench without using Gust, as we want our draw supporters to be active every turn. We want to be Arvening for pieces we need for combos. We want to be Ionoing to disrupt our opponent and draw ourselves cards. And of course, Lilies, just to get us pieces that we need to get our combos off. So the fact that we realistically need to support her most turns, unless we have a very good natural setup, so we can't really be relying on things like Boss. Obviously, we can Arven the counter catcher, which feels a little bit more powerful, but our deck can end up pulling ahead sometimes, especially if we get a good start. So this Sneasel allows us to activate the bench without the need for Gust. Now, the reason this is so strong is because the stage 2 decks are often trying to item lock us, make us have a slower setup, and they're trying to get their own Monkey Dories down, stuff like that. Well, Sneasel needs 2 damage to knock out Pidgeys. In a Charizard deck, it needs 3 damage to knock out Dracloaks, Curlias that are on the bench, and it needs 4 damage to knock out Monkey Dories on the opponent's bench, or anything over 100 HP. Now, all of those things are very, very key in a lot of our matchups, and allows us to pull ahead. Now, against Dragapult, if they are sat there behind a Budu and not doing a lot else apart from getting into the Dracloaks, well, guess what? We've got the perfect answer. We've got a Sneasel with 80 HP that is weak to Budu, means that it's going to be taking 20 damage from Itchy Pollen every turn, which means we've got a lovely 2 damage to move over, and then we've got our Sinister Surges to generate some damage to move those over with Monkey Dories as well, meaning we're able to start taking away Dracloaks before they ever get close to getting into a Dragapult. And it also means we can chase down the energy attachments on the bench, meaning that they really struggle to get into the game until they find their Neo upper energy. So that's where Sneasel has felt the best in testing and definitely utilised. It also means in Gardevoir, if they are playing a thinner Guardy line, or sort of slowly building up to one, only having 1 or 2 Curlier in the deck, it means we're able to take those away before they get the rare Candy play. Rolts can be taken care of, especially if we go first in that game. They get rolls down on our second turn. We're able to utilize Sneasel and take Gardevoir away before they even get a chance to get into it. And as I mentioned, my favourite part of the deck is in those matchups where our opponent has Monkey Dories as well. Well, we can definitely move our damage over them and access those and knock them out with Strike the Sleeper in order to sort of win that little war. We know that the Monkey Dory wars in some of the sort of Guardy Mirrors and stuff like that can get a pretty tedious, but Sneasel takes care of all of that for us. And yeah, definitely an underrated attacker over the weekend. I was really, really impressed by it. So, the next up is the supporting cast. Now, Pheasantipity and Petulant play a very hybrid role in the deck, so I think we'll start with Psyduck, as it's pretty much the simplest and most ineffective card in the deck. Now, don't get me wrong, in the Dragapult matchup, what it's mainly in the deck for, and the Lopunny matchup, it is very effective. It allows us to be able to have a good time into those matchups, as it stops Dusclops and Dusknoir from being activated, and forces our opponent to put damage counters onto Psyduck as opposed to other things. So, Psyduck coming down, it's got 70 HP. Now, hopefully, our opponent doesn't sort of get the Hawlucha knockout play all in one. If they leave 6 damage counters on us, well, guess what? 2 Monkey Dories and the movement of that 6 damage back to a Dragapult is a knockout for our Brute Bonnet. So it can be a bit of a bait in that sense, that if our opponent sort of tries to deal with Psyduck over 2 turns, that's not going to be possible. Now, I found that sort of in testing the better Dragapult players I was against with this sort of deck would sort of spread damage very sparingly across my backline, 20 here, 10 here, 20 here, so on and so forth. But people who are maybe a little bit less experienced will sort of leave a big chunk of damage all in one place. And then if they don't actually get rid of Psyduck all in one go, you're able to utilize that damage for your own good, which always feels very good, right? We don't have to Sinister Surge, we don't need any big combos that turn. All we need to do is move that back over. So Psyduck filling that small role. I think the other thing I should note is that against Dragapult, it really allows us to stay in the game due to the fact that they can even use just a Dusclops to put 50 damage onto a Toxtricity, counter catcher up another one, knock out both both Toxtricities. Sorry, use a Dusknoir, put damage on Toxtricity, and then of course use the Phantom Dive, the 6 on the bench, and knock out the active. So you could get rid of both of those in one turn, which would obviously be very detrimental to our game plan if we didn't have an attacker set up. So Psyduck taking away a lot of the options they have in that deck. I didn't actually face a Lopunny Dusknoir much in testing or at the tournament, so I can't say quite how effective it is versus that deck. They are a little bit more aggressive than Dragapult, sort of with a lot of gust and moving around the board quite quickly, but I imagine it still does take away a lot of options. But definitely something I need to look into a little bit more. Petulant EX won me an awful lot of games on the last turn of the game. I think that a lot of games where I was coming to the end of time, or games that might have ended in a draw, this Petulant was something the opponent forgot about as having a very, very good attack in Irritated Outburst, doing 300 if our opponent went down to 1 prize, as they very, very often did versus this deck. And then it just meant that all I'd need to do is Sinister Surge to this, move over a little damage, and I was able to do as much as sort of 340, 360 if I had 3 Monkey Dory down. So this won me a load of games that I maybe didn't have any business winning on the last turn, but the Petulant very strong over there for that reason. And then you've got the Subjugating Chains that allows us to sort of have free movement around the board if our opponent is trying to sort of have any sort of locking shenanigans or gusting things up into the active. If we aren't able to use our air balloons or just hard retreat in that matter, we can use our subjugating chains as well to move around. So that's another way that it sort of plays that hybrid role. It has a very good sort of supporting cast ability, but also a very, very strong attacker. Not something you want to be utilizing sort of in the mid game. You really want to be waiting for that 2 or 1 prize big swing to get through something quite significant at the end of the game. And then Pheasantipity, we've all seen it happen a number of times where our opponent might not be drawing the best, anything like that on stream, and they end up using Cruel Arrow to get through their opponent. Serendipity actually becomes quite a good attacker in our deck, just to the fact that it's actually quite easy to set up with Sinister Surge, 2 Sinister Surges and attachments, so on and so forth. And Cruel Arrow, the same way that Sneasel is very good into those evolving decks, this can also be very, very strong into them as well. So not just in the deck for Flip the Script, as everyone knows, one of the best abilities in the game right now, drawing 3 cards if your opponent took a knockout last turn. Cruel Arrow allows us to, again, access our opponent's bench and take knockouts without them really seeing it coming. I think people sort of can set up or play around with Serendipity, but it's very unoften you actually see it happen. So maybe not something that comes to people's minds straight away. So not something that's often played around and can very often be effective in taking early game knockouts. But not too much to say about these guys as much as the attackers. They have their roles and their abilities within the deck, but of course our attackers having a little bit more diverse of the time. So here, just going through all those again, same sort of thing as the last ones. I just discussed it all there. Side deck only having 2 lines there, but yeah, it's all of these things can be sort of stopped on, screenshotted, anything that you need. Without listening to my voice, you can sort of use this to check it out yourself. So moving into the trainers, why these supporters? Now, I think that, sorry, I accidentally pressed the button to go to the next one. So why these supporters? As I mentioned before, our deck is very, very, very combo heavy. So it's really important that we have a big lean towards draw support, as opposed to sort of techie supporters. Now we have the one boss. That Gust felt very strong over the weekend when I had it, but there were some games where I didn't use boss, didn't need to use boss, as the thing we want to knock out is very, very often in the active in this deck. Just because we are a 1 prize deck, we're able to trade up a little bit more. We're able to take a back seat. We can go down quite a number of prizes and still get into the game with a lot of these matchups. So it's not that we need to really overextend or rush to take knockouts with something like a boss. We can sort of wait for that threat to move into the active before we get rid of it with something like a Brute Bonnet. So the Arven, I did sort of start with 4 Lilies, 3 Research, 3 Iono, but this deck, Ultra Ball, already felt very, very costly using it, because I feel that almost every piece in this deck is needed in every matchup, whether it be the energy surge, the energy switches, things like that. So as much as Research maybe had a little bit more of a power peak and a lot more burst potential, Arven felt like the much more consistent contender for that 4 slot, just because it can grab us nest balls, again, energy switches, energy searches, counter catcher. It sort of felt like a 20-sided dice. It gave us access to any sort of game plan that we wanted in the early game. It's proven to be that card in a lot of decks for pretty much its whole time in the game since release, and it does very much the same in this deck. And as I mentioned before, sometimes we really want to aggressively get into our toxicities using that one-off Buddy Poffin, using that TM Evo, in sort of anything with Buddoos, Frillishes, stuff like that. So he was really, really key in doing that in a lot of matchups. Now, Lily's Determination probably needs to have the least said about it. Getting those 8 cards early game in a combo deck is absolutely incredible. And I honestly think if this card read sort of any differently, I don't think the viability of this deck would be quite the same. It would probably still be playable, but the 8 cards just make such a difference early game when you're trying to get sort of evolutions, you're trying to get energy, into hand, as well as enough in the deck to be able to Sinister Surge, attach to your Monkey Dories. Sometimes we need to find a super rod before we use Lily to draw into the Pokemon we need, stuff like that. And this is really the activator for all of those things. Iono, we already mentioned Claw of Darkness, but being a 1 prize deck, we know that our opponent's pretty much going to be taking a knockout every single turn. Our Pokemon are much smaller, much more squishy, and do not need as much resources to get through as maybe some of the other Pokemon in the game, and therefore Iono becomes very effective early on in the game. We might be down to a 6-3 prize deprivation very early on in the game, and therefore Iono is keeping us at 6 cards and putting our opponent down to 3 straight away, and that can sometimes allow us to get the buffer we need to get back into the game. But apart from that, it's just a little bit extra consistency, even if we're using it in the early game. With these combo decks, if you see your opening hand and it doesn't look that great, none of the cards are useful right now, always the best place for them at the bottom of the deck. And that is exactly what Iona does. Shuffles a hand, puts it at the bottom, and we draw 6 new cards. As much as Lily might see a few more cards, Iona makes sure that we don't draw into any of those cards that we don't really need right now. So sometimes more optimal to be using on the first, second turn or anything like that than something like a Lily's. So next, we have our items, tools, and stadiums. So I think that the first thing I want to cover is for Nest Ball. It's the most simple thing in the deck. Everything is a basic in this deck apart from our Toxtricities. So Nest Ball, absolutely crucial. There is only one Pokemon in the deck that's 70 HP, and that is the Toxels. Hence why we play one Buddy Buddy Poffin. Now, we only play one because it's not necessary to our setup to get 2 Toxel down turn 1. It does feel good, but there are matchups where we're going to get item locked and things like that. We're getting a second Toxel down becomes a little bit more difficult, and in those matchups, we want to be Arvening for the Buddy Buddy Poffin. But apart from that, the Nest Ball and the Artisan is going to be our main use of search to get those basics into play, and of course, always effective in doing that. Now, Ultra Ball, it's a 3 count, as with the 3 Toxtricity we play and the 3 Ultra Ball, we have 3 outs to be able to get those, as well as the TM Evo, so 7 outs to get those Toxtricities. So it's really important we get at least one of those down turn on our second turn if we haven't TM Evo, just to make sure we can use things like the Sneasel and like the Petulant for just those 2 energy attacks, as that allows us to get into the game. So Ultra Ball sort of making us able to do that. The reason I don't play 4 is because, as I mentioned, it really does feel bad to discard anything on this deck. We need plenty of energy. We need 3 of our Super Rod. We often need our Energy Search. We need the Air Balloon, so on and so forth. So 3 meant that we weren't sort of relying on the fact that we needed Ultra Ball to get things. And so Pokepad is a astronomical upgrade for this deck, and we can sort of cut that Ultra Ball maybe down to 1 if we put 4 Pokepad in. So that is a lot better, but we do need enough Ultra Ball to make sure we see them often enough. Now, 3 Super Rod, probably the most important card in the deck. We're going to be using an awful lot of energy. And as I mentioned, our Pokemon are very squishy, very easy to knock out, which means they oftentimes end up in the discard. And so we need enough Super Rod to get those back into the deck to make sure that we're able to utilize Sinister Surge for our damage modification, to set up our next attacker, so on and so forth. So although a very simple thing to discuss the Super Rod, it is one of the most important cards in the deck. The counter catcher is already discussed. It's just that little bit of extra gust, so we don't have to play boss on a turn. We can grab a balloon, a TM Evo, so on and so forth with Arven, as well as grabbing a counter catcher and being able to gust things in the active. So very key card in that sense, but we do only need the one. Now, the Energy Search was something that I put in. As I mentioned, we don't want to be discarding too many cards as it feels bad. So I did not opt for Earthen Vessel. I thought the Energy Search, just getting the 1 energy we need for a Monkey Dory instead of sort of getting 2 in hand, as we do want as much energy as we want. We do want as much energy as we need in the deck to make sure that we always have Sinister Surge active without the need for too many Super Rods in the early game. And so Energy Search just allows us to get that energy for a Monkey Dory, or get the energy for the retreat, or get the energy to be able to use TM Evo, so on and so forth. So a very key card in that sense, but again, only needing the 1. We've talked about Buddy Buddy Poffin already. Now, the Unfair Stamp was how can I describe what the Unfair Stamp? It did not feel amazing over the weekend, if I'm being honest. I think that it's definitely the best A-Spec we can play in this deck right now. I tried Prime Catcher. I even tried Hyper Aroma to see if we could cut down on the Ultra Balls a little bit. I tried Secret Box, but it sort of felt a bit weak without a sort of game-defining stadium in the deck, something like a Rocket's Tower. So I settled for Unfair Stamp. When it did brick people, which was very unoften over the weekend, it felt good. When it comboed with Claw of Darkness, it felt very good. But I think for just sort of a pseudo use, when I'm feeling a bit behind and stuff like that, it almost felt like people drew out of it most times. And as you can imagine, in several matchups, Gold Dengos, Pidgeot Zard, Eevee box, they always seem to have like a Pidgeotto. The Noctowl ended up in their hand. They already had the Goldengos down to where they could draw out, So overall, it didn't feel that great, and I felt that maybe there could be something else if I was to go back and play this deck. I do think critically, it is the best A spec you can play, but I'm definitely going to be trying things again going to EUIC. I think a lot of the list is pretty perfect and not a lot that I would change at all. In fact, I don't think there's anything I would change, but maybe this card here just becomes something else and brings a small package with it to make the A spec a little bit more effective. But I would stick with this for now, as it can feel obviously very powerful. But the fact that we play 3 Iono as well, it does feel like a fourth Iono. And yeah, but yeah, I honestly think I use this to refresh my hand and give me some sort of in-turn draw on the back of a supporter before a supporter, more than I use it to disrupt my opponents, which feels a little bit crazy to say based on the fact that the text reads so powerfully. 2 Air Balloon and a TM Evo. TM Evo we discussed, literally only in here to get into those toxicities when we need them a little bit more quickly, a little bit more significantly when we're not going to be able to use things like our Ultra Ball, as we don't want to really be reliant on Lilies and Ionos to draw directly into our toxicities. Relying on that can go well quite often, and if you miss, it never spells nice things. You pretty much fall behind pretty quickly after that. And then 2 Air Balloon. Toxicity does have a 2 retreat cost, which could almost be perceived as the biggest weakness of the card. So Air Balloon sort of covers us that, gives us a little bit of insurance, meaning we don't have to put Petra and EX on board if it just gets gusted in the active but not necessarily locked. As well as that, they're quite nice to put onto Monkey Dories just to be able to move it up every turn. We know that Monkey Dory is sort of a mainstay on the board. I think our opponent would pretty much always rather gust the toxicity itself than the Monkey Dory. So putting one down there pretty much feels like we've got a free retreater in deck all the time. And so that is why every one of these trainers. And just to say, if you've got any questions or queries or even some criticisms of anything that I've picked, please let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to discuss with you. And then finally, 10 Dark Energy. I felt that this is the sweet spot. 9 felt too little. It felt that once we had 3 energy on a Brute Bonnet, 2 on Monkey Dories, we only had 5 energy sort of to play with, meaning that if we needed to set up another attacker, if we prized any more than 1 energy, everything felt a bit cramped very quickly and we were a lot more reliant on Super Rod. Whereas with 10, 3 on a Brute Bonnet and 2 Monkey Dories, we've got 5 energy to play with, meaning that even if we prize 2, we've got 3 energy left over to set up Absol, to set up Brute Bonnet, so on and so forth. So we're a little bit less reliant on Super Rod, as we can have 2 attackers at the same time, set up and ready to go. So finally, get to the bulk of my tournament run. I won't go into humongous detail about everything, but I will sort of talk through the matchups, what I did in each of them, what my sort of brief and short game plan was into each thing, and why the result was what it was. So as I mentioned, I played Greninja round 1. It was if you've been following the channel, something I was considering for this tournament, and it did seem like quite a lot of them did well, to be fair. There were quite a lot on top tables throughout day 1. There were quite a lot in day 2 that were running around and doing quite well. So I was pretty impressed overall. And funnily enough, when I sat down against Kinga, she actually goes to Swansea, which is only about an hour away from my local store. So I'd played them before in sort of League Cups and stuff. So it was quite nice to sit down and sort of go, oh, no way, like, what are the odds of us sort of pairing round 1? So I think game 1, I got absolutely wiped off the board very, very quickly by Mirage Barrage. It was just, I don't play Shaman. Everything in the deck has got quite low HP. So yeah, Mirage Barrage just really, really pounding down and taking sort of 4 prizes very, very quickly. And then, with the Pidgeot in play, wasn't really able to utilize Unfair Stamp quite as much. And quite funnily as well, in game one, I Unfair Stamped them turn two, and they drew into Lily's Grand Tree off the two cards. So just nothing going right in that game one at all. But game two, I utilized the Sneasel a lot more. I was able to sort of pick off Froakies and Pidgeys before they turned into anything threatening. And therefore, the Grand Tree sort of felt very ineffective when it finally came down, just because when the opponent was finally able to get into Greninja, I already had Psyduck down, and it meant that Dusk Noir sort of couldn't help them get over the line, taking out my Toxtricity, so on and so forth. So ended up in a tie. I was happy with that. The matchup felt a little bit scary if they got the turn two Grand Tree, so I was just happy to get through that round and move on. Now, Colt Noir, I mentioned previously. It feels like a pretty strong matchup for the deck, especially with the Sneasel. I feel like in this, I literally, as soon as I saw the Dreepy flip over, I went straight for the TM evolution, got into the Toxtricities, and then just started using Sneasel to pick off your cloaks. I was just following the energy around the board, and then sort of in the mid game, once they started getting into Dusclopses, I benched Psyduck so to make sure they were sort of locked there. And I'm pretty sure at some point I bossed the Dusclops into the active with Psyduck down, and then I was just sort of jumping over his head with Strike the Sleeper into anything on my opponent was putting down. And that sort of played out 2 times over the 2 games, and I was able to take a swift victory. Omar Shaheen, the Goldengo, I actually got baited quite hard by this because they started a Riolu and a Solrock. So I went first and sort of started setting up my board without a Petulant, and sort of filled my board very quickly to make sure that I had enough Monkey Dory down and a Brute Bonnet to make sure I could get through a Mega Lucario early on. And then during their turn, they benched 2 Gimmighoul, and I was like, oh no, I've really messed up, just because I now don't have the room to sort of lock a Solrock or get the damage down on the Goldengo with the Petulant. Because I just hadn't seen the Lucario and the Goldengo for a long while now. It sort of moved over to the Cramorant and the Mega Lopunny, so I was pretty surprised by that. So I managed, however, to counter capture a Makoita into the active and use Sneasel again to sort of move things around. But my hope was actually that Sneasel got knocked out, so I could then get Petulant into play. And I then gusted up a Goldengo, used the Petulant to put damage onto it. They used a picnic basket, but it meant they still had 4 damage on them going into my turn. And then I was able to sort of take 2 prize knockouts pretty consistently going from there, and managed to take the win. And I'm pretty sure in game two, Irma just did not have a good time. It wasn't a complete dead draw. I think they sort of set up early, got onto the Goldengos, and then just weren't able to sort of get the energy to take knockouts. And then, of course, if you're leaving a 2 prize in the active against this deck that can trade up, I'm always going to feel pretty good about that. I've already mentioned a little bit about Philip D'Souza's game. Had a really good game against him. It was very intricate. I think there were a lot of plays. I think I played very well going into the second game, sort of recognizing different win cons with Absol, stuff like that. However, I did dead draw a bit in the second game, so I wasn't sort of able to utilize that new game plan that I'd sort of worked out during game one. And they were able to take a pretty swift best of 3, to be honest with you. But I learned a lot from that, which then helped me in my day 2 games against Gardevoir, getting a tie and a win. As much as we're dark type, Gardevoir doesn't actually feel like the best matchup. I would say it's more 50-50, maybe a tiny bit unfavored. I think the Jellicent version is probably a little better for us, as they don't play Drifloon to get through the Mega Absol. But I say that, but I lost and tried to put Guardy Jellies and then beat the normal one. But I still stand with it. I think that I think the first game I actually prized to Super Odd and had to use one, obviously, to get some dark energy back in the deck early on. But by that point, the Jellicent had come into the active, and after that point, I'd realised that my boss was prized as well, because it's not something I was sort of thinking about using. It wasn't something I looked through on my first deck search. I was more looking for, my Sneasel, my energy, my toxicities, the TM Evo to get it down. And then once the Jellicent had actually been set up, I went in the deck and looked for boss, and it wasn't there. And yeah, that pretty much then meant that I couldn't super rod anymore, because I couldn't use the counter catcher, obviously, as my other option of Gust. So I actually ran out of energy. So that was the reason I lost game one as well. Then going into round five, my tournament run in Lille and Gdansk both times was ended by Alakazam. So when I saw the Alakazam, I was fuming. I was thinking in my head, not something I'd put any time into testing at all, just because I don't think the deck is all that great. But again, it did pretty well with conversion and people doing it. But I went up against Tom, and in the first game, he just could not get an Alakazam out. I think he had about 40 cards in hand at one point and still hadn't hit a rare candy. Now, I don't know if he checked whether they were prized or they were in deck or anything like that, but he was obviously just a little bit frustrated that he wasn't able to take advantage of that, which then meant Sneasel once again was able to sort of take advantage of the lower HP Pokemon on the bench, getting through those. And the battle cage coming down did make things a little bit more awkward then, just because I couldn't Sneasel, so I then had to start using Brute Bonnet, which doesn't feel like a great trade into Alakazam because it's 3 energy, but I managed to get over the line in that. And then game two was literally just trading back and forth, punches, punches, punches. And I think it came down to the case that my last two prizes I was able to take with the toxicities themselves, setting both up for gentle slaps. So I was able to get down 3 Monkey Dory by that point, charge up 3 times to a toxicity, move 60 to a Abra on the bench, and then take the knockout on the active, and then pretty much just doing the same thing again, not taking another knockout on an Abra, but just using gentle slap for the knockout. So I was able to get through that in the end. But yeah, it didn't feel great. I do feel like maybe if Tom had some better draws, it would be a little bit more of a tight matchup. But nonetheless, then going against Charles Campbell, which blew my mind. I was not expecting to see a Typhlosion. It was a straight Typhlosion, no Dracloaks. There was a 101 Pidgeot line in it, I believe, but it never came down during the games. And so it just meant that if my opponent was there, sort of taking the time to get into Typhlosions, I was able to pick off their Colabas on the bench pretty easily. I was able to use Sneasel to get rid of them. I was able to gust them up and use Petulant and leave damage there. And then I think the Petulant was also really good, as I was able to sort of move into a Quilava, leave the 7 damage on it, and then start moving damage to the bench to make sure that I had, obviously, knockouts on both Typhlosions once they got up. And I just think my deck was a little bit more efficient at taking prizes than theirs was. As much as they were doing a lot more damage than me on the whole, I just think that, my deck was a little bit quicker and a little bit faster into the game both times. And yeah, I was able to do it like that then. Then Simon Parr, Terrazard, a matchup that I sort of thought was more 50-50, but I think it's actually favoured, as they do have to put down 2 prizes quite quickly. You have knockdowns you can lock in the active with Petulant, and there's loads of different sort of damage modifications you can do. You can use Sneasel to get rid of Charmanders and stuff like that. And then Charizard only needs 5 damage counters on it to take knockouts as well. So you are sort of able to, put some residual damage onto the Zard, or maybe snipe a Charmander for a little bit of damage. And eventually that Charizard is going to have to come up and attack, as they don't have enough alternative attackers in the deck, unlike sort of a Zard Pidgeot. And then you're able to take the knockout on it quite easily from there. And then the Terrapagos sort of being even easier to knock out if they're going in with that. So I was able to dispatch this quite quickly. I think this was the quickest best of 3 I had all weekend. And shout out to Simon Parr, lovely guy, played as well as he could. But I think that both of us sort of noticed that the game played a very similar pattern both times. And then, funny story, I bumped into Tord after that and was pretty much like, yeah, I'm in day 2. I've got the results already, playing a bit of a fun deck, bit of a rogue deck, something I've made. And he was like, oh, great, like really cool. And we're sort of chatting and reminiscing. I haven't seen Tord for a number of years now. It hasn't been going to events as much, so it was nice to catch up. But in that time, I showed him my deck and showed him the 60 cards, sort of explained what everything did. And I said, well, if you want to see it in action, I guess we'll just have to pair. And lo and behold, I look at the pairings and Tord is there, and we end up having to play. Now, what I didn't tell Tord is I think that Mega Box is actually a completely and utterly unwinnable matchup for this deck. I think that you perhaps can roll into a win if they have a very poor start. But if they get the turbo energy energized down to the Absol, trust me, you are not in for a good time. We are a very combo based deck. So Claw of Darkness does not feel very good. Tord, obviously, from me talking to him, very quickly realized how important Super Rod was in the deck, and so began taking away Super Rod at every opportunity. And then it was really funny in the second game. He Claw of Darkness got rid of an Arven. He said, because I know you play unfair stamp, I'm not going to let you use that. And so I used the lilies. And after the lilies, there was another Arven in my hand. And of course, he Claw of Darkness took the Arven away again. So I continually tried to get back into the unfair stamp without using an Arven. I couldn't get it. And he actually discarded 4 Arvens in a row after me using sort of like Pheasantipity and Ionos and stuff like that, which was quite funny. So there were 4 Arven in my discarding game too, without me playing a single one. So we had a really good time though. Really fun games, but yeah, just as a highlight when I go through the matchups, Mega Absol probably our worst matchup, but it's okay. It's not too much of a percentage of a deck. Toward a better player than me anyway, so I'm sure he would have found a way through the matchup anyway. But he had a lot of compliments for the deck and said it was very interesting and something that he'd definitely try out in the future. So shout outs to him, greatest player of all time and a good friend. So yeah, very pleased with those games. And then the final game of my day one, obviously the first game of game two, I played Oliver Elwick, another really cool UK player. Had a good laugh in that. But this was discovered to sort of be a not so good matchup as well. Um, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that I was on EVBox for quite a while. I just thought that the Dragapult and the Guardian matchup were a little bit too shaky for me to want to take it. I really wanted to make sure that I had at least 2 out of 3 of the big 3 matchups be positive. And so I put down Flareon for a bit, but I will most definitely come back to it at some point. I really do love the deck. But Oliver, I didn't really know how to go about the matchup. Obviously, I know that I want to go through Flareons, but do I want to play around Teal Mask in the early game and get a lot of Toxel down? I did that twice and got 3 Toxel down early, but the Teal Mask didn't come off. So then my bench felt very bloated, and I didn't have room for the correct attackers and the correct amount of Monkey Dories, and so everything just felt a bit weird. And then I think while I was trying to figure out the matchup and what to do, I was just getting burning charged for 130, which is obviously enough to knock out most things in the deck. And so I was under a lot of pressure to try and come up with a response, and I just wasn't able to think quick enough on my feet in that to come up with an answer for sort of my bench being so bloated. So we quickly went to a game two, and I dead drew like no other game this weekend. It was quite incredible. Literally like 6 energy in hand, and I shook Oliver's hand and just said, have a good rest of the evening. But really good, great guy, and I really enjoyed the game. But I think that I need to work a little bit more on the Flareon matchup. I wish I could sit here and tell you, like a lot of the other matchups, exactly how you should be going about it, or what my theory is and how you should be. But I still don't know, to be honest with you. I think that it's going to take a little bit of work on that front. So stay tuned for that. Then Matteo Felicio. Now, the disappointing thing with this is that I should have won. I had game in hand as time was called. We had to have a judge call because I attacked, had game in hand, and then my opponent didn't draw a card for the turn yet as they were deciding what to promote. I'm not at all suggesting it was malicious. Obviously, they were allowed to take a couple of seconds to decide what they were going to promote, because I'm sure they didn't want to put up the wrong thing and lose the game instantly. They were saying they took a bit of time as they thought there might have been a way to take 4 prizes in a turn. using a combination of Monkey Dory and different attackers. But during that time was called, which meant that I didn't then get another turn. So as much as I had game in hand when they said that they weren't able to take those prizes, I didn't get another turn. So therefore it ended in a tie. So I think I went about the Guardi matchup in the complete opposite way I mentioned before. Used Absol early, was really aggressively taking prizes in game one, and was able to push over the line. Game two, I actually prized Absol, but I also prized Sneasel. So I wasn't able in the early game to sort of take advantage of them setting up. I was able really only to use Petulant, which wasn't knocking anything out because they only really had Monkey Dory and Rolts in play. I couldn't gust the Rolts or take advantage of them with Sneasel. So I was sort of just leaving empty damage around their board, which Monkey Dories then were just throwing them back and forth. And then the Jellicent came down, and I was sort of a lot less able to sort of put combos together. And as they started to then gust my Monkey Dories up and knock them out, I wasn't able to sort of get the Super Rod to get them back in play. And eventually their Monkey Dories took over. And then, as I mentioned, game three sort of went very similarly to game one. Mega Absol really putting on the pressure. And as I said, I had game in hand. I had the Petulant EX and Boss in hand. They'd used all their Iono, so I definitely had it. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it just ended in a tie. Sam Hunt, obviously not to go over the same thing again. They didn't play Drifloon, but didn't play Jellicent as well. It was sort of a mishmash of Frillish with the cape and Screamtail and stuff like that. They didn't draw the best over both games, which definitely helped my pursuit in Absol. But Glory Darkness just really tore things up and was able to sort of take charge in both games. So shout out to Sam. He's actually a local from the same league that I go to. So he seems to, as he said, he seems to dead draw against me every time he plays me. Of course, Absol's not going to help him in that matter. But yeah, very happy to get the win there. So I sort of went 1-1-1 versus Guardi, which sort of highlights the fact, as I mentioned, that it is a very 50-50 matchup. Then we had Bo Zhao. Grimmsnarl was weird. The first time that I played against Grimmsnarl with this deck, I did not expect to see it at all this weekend. I know it is still played a little bit, but I just wasn't expecting to see it. And it really obviously comes down to Monkey Dory. I had 3 Monkey Dory down with Toxtricities, and then I was just using Brute Bonnets to try and get through Grimmsnarls when they came down. And if they weren't Grimmsnarls yet, I was just trying to use Sneasel to attack the bench. But as you can imagine, between Frostlass, between the Monkey Dories, they were able to rack up damage, maybe just that little bit faster than me. So I had a bit of a slower game one, and they were able to sort of take control of the board maybe quicker than I was. And game two was the opposite. I was able to sort of get established and start sniping their Frostlasses on the bench, sniping their Impidimps. And so when they finally got into a Grimmsnarl, I think I only had 3 prizes left, and I was able to sort of close out the game from there. So that ended in a tie. Matt Mitchell, the first normal Goldengo that I played, they did play the Cramorant, which I thought would make the matchup a little bit closer, but it actually didn't make any difference. They still ended up going down to 1 prize, as you'd expect, and that's all you want to do with Goldengo. They've got no way of taking 2 prizes in a turn, so you just push, push, push. You keep up in the prize race, and then you can use Petulant EX at the end. All you need is 1 Toxtricity in play, or an energy and an E-switch, anything. There's loads of different ways to do it, but you just need that Petulant to do the 300 damage at the end of the game, and you cannot lose this matchup. You need 4 damage counters to kill a Goldengo. That's just 2 Sinister Surges. You're able to fall behind a little bit. Soul Rocks are only able 1 time in the game using the Vitality or the Power Up Pro to get through something with more than 70 HP. Apart from that, they are locked at that number, which means Petulant becomes very effective. Sneasel becomes very effective. So there are lots of ways around this deck. I think as long as you don't sort of start a 2 prizer that gets taken advantage of very quickly, or even a 3 prizer in Mega Absol, you are all good, and it feels like a very, very strong matchup, probably the best one for the deck. And then Joshua Palkata. So funnily enough, I'd actually played quite a few games against Cerulege, and my friend Mike, who actually took this same deck to the tournament, with perhaps a little bit less practice than myself with the deck, played Cerulean early in the game. We both agreed it was pretty difficult as a matchup, not because of the damage he needed, but they're sort of putting on active pressure with a lot of gust. Able to get multiple Pokemon down on the bench, still having that early game pressure from Soul Rock, stuff like that. And then, of course, nothing on the board really being safe. So locking things in the active with Jet Energies as well, not really an option. So it really felt like it had an answer for a lot of what our deck was trying to do. And every time I took a knockout on a Cerulean for 2 prizes, they were pretty much able to come back in and do more damage and, get the gust on the toxicity, making sure that I wasn't able to have a follow-up attack with a Brute Bonnet the next turn, so on and so forth. So the deck itself feels a little bit too aggressive for our deck. And I think we need a little bit of luck to get through this matchup. Again, though, a very, very low play deck and very low percentages. Joshua Pyle, Carter, actually a really nice guy. He really badly drew game 1, and I was able to take the win in that game just based on that. And then I was making a joke that his hands had bad juju, so I wasn't going to let him touch my deck anymore. And he cut my deck and shuffled it a little bit. And then from there, I dead drew for the next 2 games. And every time I started getting like a semblance, so like I would like fairs and get into some things, get a combo for a knockout. And he was like, right, that's it. I'm touching your deck. And he'd sort of like rub his hands over the top of my deck and be like, bad juju. And then again, I'd dead draw. So his hands are evil. If you play against Joshua Pyle Carter, don't let him shuffle your deck. Don't let him cut you. You just have to call the judge and say, no, his hand's got bad juju. But yeah. So a really fun matchup. And he was actually over from Canada, and he gave me a custom dice for his shop, the Deck Box. Make sure you go check them out if you're in Canada. And he also gave me a card, which is really sweet, and said if I'm ever in Canada, I can use that card to get free entry to an event at his store. So that was very sweet as well. So I had a great time into him, and I hope he had a safe trip home. And hopefully he sees this, or someone sees this and can let him know. But that was one of my more fun games of the day. I was already pretty pleased with my performance in day 2. 2-2-2. It's not the best, but it's not bad. I think that I was happy to do a lot better than other people I know that have got into day 2 and sort of gone on to lose 5. I was pretty happy. I think the matchups that I am able to be a little bit more competitive in, I was able to win. The 50-50s I tied, and the matchups that didn't feel so good, I lost. And I think that that's something that really should be happening in day 2. I think that all the players are good, all the players are strong, and so the day should very much come down to who's the better player at that point with their deck. And if the matchup is good and the player is good, they should be winning every time. And I think that's what was highlighted very much so in my second day of the tournament. So I hope you enjoyed that. Finally, I know it's really blurry. I could not get this to look any better, no matter how many times I tried to do it. I'm not going to go through everything in detail, as this video is already very long, but I am going to go and make another video that will come out sort of early next week, later this week, that will have sort of a little bit more of a descript matchup plan into everything. This is going to be the deck I play for EUIC, especially with the new news that Ascended Heroes is not going to be in. So I think the deck will pretty much look almost exactly the same. So I will make that video and get it up, so anyone that does want to join me in playing a little bit of Tox Box at that tournament is able to. But as I highlighted, anything with sort of Pidgeots, stuff like that, that's able to get out of any sort of disruption and Fear Stamp, doesn't feel that great, and therefore you can see Charizard down there. The Flareon, as I said, didn't feel that great. Grimmsnarl felt a little bit weird with the Monkey Dories. And yeah, everything down there. The ones right at the bottom, very unfavored. As I mentioned, Mega Box, especially when it's being piloted by the best player in the world. And Cerulean did not feel all that good. 50-50s. Both the Guardy matchups. The Greninja matchup, I do think, is winnable, as we saw with the tie. But I do think they can be quite scary if they get the Mirage Barrage quite early. So you need to make sure you're on pace and you're using that Sneasel to take away things before they become scary. And then Joltik Box, same with Joltik Dengo. I just think the presence of Iron Hands early on in the game means that we're not able to up trade as well as we might like. Our opponent's going to be taking 2 prizes on our 1 prizes, and Ampy very much, especially if they play a future booster, able to get through everything in our deck. that we're going to want to have down early game. So yeah, definitely a 50-50 there. Dragapult's in favour. Dragapult can always do crazy Dragapult things, don't forget that. And I think that matchup becomes significantly worse if we're not able to get a Psyduck down. Terrabox, Lucario, sort of Kangabooth, stuff like that. All of these things, big Pokemon that we can uptrade into, and that always feels very good. The reason Kangabooth and Absol are a little bit different is, as I mentioned, it's actually the Claw of Darkness taking away our key combo pieces, getting rid of our super rods, our energy switches, our Arvins, our Unfair Stamps is actually what stops us from getting into the game, as we don't have any onboard draw. So if our hand is what it is at the end of our turn and it goes into our opponent's turn, they will see those cards, they will be able to get rid of those cards. There's no way for us to put them on the top of the deck, move them out of hand, anything like that once we've used our supporter, and so that is why it's unfavored. Whereas Mega Kangaskhan is all about defense, and we like that as we have an infinite damage cap. And then everything on the top line is just things that we can trade up into that don't really have many other options of main attackers. I know that obviously in Roaring Moon, we have seen the baby Roaring Moon, but they need an awful lot of energy to be getting through some of the bigger things on our board, and so we're not really all that worried about that. Goldengo, I do think, is our absolute best matchup. I'm yet to lose to one in any sort of vicinity, whether that be online, whether that be at tournaments. So, of course, it's Goldengo. It can do some great things. It draws a lot of cards. I'm not saying I'm never going to lose to Goldengo, but it does feel very favourable, even if they play Picnic Basket. And then everything to the right of that is pretty much just you being able to uptrade, apart from Install, at which point we play one prize attackers, lots of them not having abilities as well, especially, like Brute Bonnet is always going to be able to get through a Cornerstone, it's always going to be able to get through a Crustle, so not something we're worried about there. So, thank you very, very much for watching. Please like and sub. As I said, I will be making a matchup guide in preparation for EUIC, as this deck is going to be pretty much exactly the same, and I'd love some of you to join me. Please leave any questions or queries or complaints or anything about the tournament in the comment section. I'm happy to answer any questions about the deck. I absolutely love playing it. And of course, any of my opponents who saw this video, shout out to you. I had a brilliant day. I don't think I had any sort of poor interactions with anyone. Everyone was very kind, very polite, and yeah, I really, really enjoyed playing Birmingham Regionals this year. So thank you very much for tuning in. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.